The Billionaire's Marriage Promise, written by Melody Archer, narrated by Lorna Faith. Chapter 1. You have millions of loyal followers worldwide. It's plain to see you've helped a lot of people turn their lives around with your online mentoring programs, books, and events. Winnie O, the most popular international daytime talk show host, sat across from Gabe Stevenson as loud cheers from the studio audience echoed off the walls. Gabe smiled and shifted slightly, uncomfortable with the praise. He nodded towards the audience before turning his blue-eyed gaze back to his host. Her unwavering gaze swept over him. Returning a casual smile, Gabe tried to hide his shaky hands. He gently squeezed the paperclip hidden in the palm of his hand. It was his usual reminder to focus so nervous jitters didn't get the better of him. I feel like most of what we know about you is from your programs, Gabe, but most of us don't know the real Gabe Stevenson. Why don't you take a few minutes to share your story? Winnie O's brown eyes held a challenge that was familiar to millions of viewers who watched her weekly show. That's a tall order, Winnie, but I'll do my best. Gabe leaned back on the soft studio chair and adjusted the sleeves of his blue designer sweater. This was always the toughest part of any interview. I was born and raised in Paradise Lake, a small town not too far from Seattle. I was the middle child of 5 sons born to the best parents we could ask for. My brothers and I had a great childhood, spending time doing activities and having fun with each other and with our mom and dad. But all that ended suddenly one day when my dad died of a heart attack. I was 13 years old. Emotion clogged his throat and he swallowed convulsively as memories invaded his senses. Gabe stared down at his feet for a moment and rubbed the back of his neck, willing himself to regain control of his turning emotions. Taking a deep breath, he looked up again, blinking back tears, as he thought of his dad. His death was sudden and unexpected. The doctor said it was caused by stress. We learned that his business partner had taken all the money out of their shared accounts, and he'd found a way to access Dad's personal account as well. We were wiped out. It was a really difficult time for all of us. I bet it was. Winnie O's brows puckered in concern, and she looked over at her audience before returning to look back at Gabe. Did you go through a period of time wondering what happened? Gabe shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Yes, I had many questions, for years. Would you share a few of them? Winnie asked. Sure. Even though I was 13 years old, I went through self-blame and wondered what I could have done differently to help my dad not be so vulnerable to sabotage. I also remembered feeling back then that there was something I didn't like about my dad's business partner. Gabe paused before he spoke again. At the time, I should have paid more attention, acted on those misgivings, and did more investigating. Maybe I could have prevented the stress my dad suffered, and maybe he wouldn't have had a heart attack. His voice cracked, and Gabe swallowed back emotion. Even though he tried to stop it, a stray tear escaped anyway. Winnie O silently handed him a box of tissues, waiting for a few moments before she asked, Did any of your questions or fears from what you saw your dad go through contribute to the reasons you began your self-development training? Absolutely. I wanted to do whatever I could to help other people so they would be better prepared for life and to help them overcome any trouble they would face. I can understand that, Winnie nodded. Please continue. Gabe looked out at the studio audience before turning back to Winnie. After the police did their investigation, my dad's partner was convicted of his crimes and went to jail. But that didn't change the fact that my father was still gone from our lives. We were left scrambling, trying to put the pieces back together of our shattered family. Gabe hesitated as compassionate sighs erupted from the studio audience. It was especially hard for my mom to make ends meet, so me and my 4 brothers helped out. My 2 older brothers, Adam and Jack, started working full-time, and I found part-time work after school. I was 13 years old at the time. Winnie asked, What work did you find at such a young age? Well, I started hauling newspapers after school for a couple of years. By the time I reached high school, I was working for a local TV station as a student reporter. They wanted to get a bird's-eye view of an average student's thoughts on different issues that affected the town. Winnie's eyes twinkled. That sounds like the perfect job for you. Gabe nodded. It really was. The only drawback was when a couple of friends at the time tried to use my new job as a reporter to get on TV. My girlfriend tried that when she asked me to interview members of her book club. I showed up, and she was the only person there. Turned out, it wasn't really an interview for the book club that she wanted. She admitted to being jealous of my growing popularity in high school, and that she wanted to be on television. She wanted to be famous. Needless to say, our relationship didn't last. I couldn't be in a relationship with someone I couldn't trust. Gabe grimaced and looked over at the audience as he remembered. His host shook her head from side to side, her brows puckered as she looked over at the studio audience. Returning to look at Gabe, Winnie signaled for the cameraman to zoom in and get a closer shot. It seems like you've experienced a few times in your life when people you trusted maneuvered their way into your life in a way that made it difficult. Gabe nodded. I guess that's true. I wish I would have known back then what I know now. His host nodded. Most of us, I'm sure, would agree that hindsight helps us see things clearer. Winnie looked out over at the audience and sighed. But let's switch to something more recent. Not long ago, I read in Seattle's business magazine that your date to the benefit gala told a reporter that you were getting married. Is there any truth to that? Sadly, no. We hadn't got to the point in our relationship where we had talked about marriage. Needless to say, we are no longer together. Gabe expelled a breath as he remembered how Maddie had burst into his interview with a reporter at the benefit gala and casually hinted that they would be married soon. It really frustrated him when people thought he could be so easily managed. Were those experiences the inspiration behind starting your career? His host tilted her head slightly to the side, her gaze intense as she focused on him. Gabe sighed. For the most part, yes. After my dad died, I was devastated. I'd just lost my best friend and mentor, and the man who encouraged me every day. Along with that, a deeper awareness that my dad's friend had betrayed him really hit home and was difficult for me to process. Gabe shifted uncomfortably. I wanted to grow up to be like the man I most admired, my dad. But I also wanted to learn how to do whatever it took to prevent people from sabotaging my family. That led me to spending time at our local library whenever I could, to read all about how to become a better person and develop a success mindset. I started learning as a teenager, and I continued to learn until finally in college, I began writing about personal development on a blog and talking on the subject on podcasts and videos. Winnie smiled. According to comments from thousands of people around the world, you've certainly helped many people and given them hope. I think that speaks for itself. Thanks so much, Winnie. That means a lot coming from you. Gabe smiled as he reflected. What I really want to do is help as many people as possible learn how they can live each day with joy, to love themselves better, and to help them reach out to others to make their dent in the world. Loud clapping from the studio audience filled the room. Gabe nodded and smiled warmly. Their show of appreciation for his work meant a lot to him. Winnie commented, I see your family is here. From their happy smiles, it looks like they're proud of you. Gabe looked over at his mom, his brothers, and their wives, and his grandparents, who were seated in the front row. They smiled as the camera panned towards them. Gabe saw his mom was a little misty-eyed, while the faces of his other family members held big grins. Gratefulness for his family welled up inside of him. Every day, I'm thankful for their love and support. Winnie responded, Support from family is so important. Gabe turned to see the audience nod vigorously. Winnie O shifted back to Gabe and the camera zoomed in for a close-up. Looks like you have everything you need, perhaps with the exception of the one thing most men want. Bracing himself at Winnie's comment, something compelled him to ask, What's that? A woman to love. His host paused, and Gabe squirmed a little, becoming really uncomfortable with where these questions were going. Tell us, Gabe, have you ever had a serious relationship or been married? Brown eyes challenged his, and he couldn't look away. Gabe could feel prickly heat rising up to his cheeks. He should have known his host would dig deeper and ask the one question he'd been able to avoid in most interviews. Gabe responded quickly. No, I haven't. It's never been a priority. Winnie looked over at him, as if doubting the truth of his words. Is it true that your marital status might be changing soon? Gabe's neck and cheeks felt like they were on fire. He looked over at the crowd, who seemed to be waiting for his answer with bated breath. Turning back to Winnie O, he decided to play dumb. What do you mean? Winnie smiled. Well, I read last month's article in one of Seattle's most popular magazines questioning whether you'd be single for long. I'm sure there are many single women out there wondering the same thing. So I wanted to ask, are the rumors true that your great-grandfather Walker Stevenson set up his will in a way that required all 5 of his great-grandsons to marry by their 27th birthday to receive their inheritance? Gabe uttered a low groan. He should have realized that at least one reporter would have found out the details of Grant's will. It seemed like he was doomed to answer the one question he hoped to avoid. Yes, as absurd as it sounds, it's true. How long do you have until the deadline? Winnie asked. A little over 6 weeks. Gabe had given himself more time to look for a wife than his older brothers had done. He liked to plan things out ahead of time. Yet even though he'd been looking for a woman to marry for almost a year now, no one had appealed to him. Now all he had was 6 weeks left to find a wife. Winnie let out a low whistle. So, you don't have a whole lot of time to find the woman you want to marry. Gabe grimaced and nodded as heat crawled up his neck. He really didn't like where this conversation was going. If you don't mind my asking, what do you inherit if you decide to go along with your great-grandfather's wishes? It looked like Winnie O was focused on the topic of his upcoming marriage, and he was stuck answering her questions. Well, Gran decided to give me his island. Most folks around Paradise Lake know the place as Walker's Island. It's about an hour away from Paradise Lake. The only buildings on the land are Gran's hunting lodge, a small guest house, and a small cottage. Gabe winced inwardly at the sighs coming from the crowd. He really didn't want to talk about Gran's ridiculous will requirement, but it looked like that Pandora's box was now wide open. That sounds like a great place to get away from the bustle of everyday life. Yeah, it is great. I have great memories of fishing and sailing every summer with my dad, granddad, and grand when I was a kid. A warmth of belonging filled Gabe as he remembered the pleasure of being with his dad, enjoying being on the water surrounding Walker's Island. Winnie smiled broadly. With so many great memories attached to Walker's Island, have you thought about going along with your great-grandfather's last wishes? Gabe turned toward the audience and cringed at the wide-eyed gazes that stared back at him. Suddenly Gabe wished he could disappear. Why had Winnie chosen to focus her interest on whether or not he was getting married? He squeezed the paperclip in his hand, once more reminding himself to play it cool and smile. I'm thinking about it. Winnie persisted. What's stopping you from saying yes? I've never found a woman I love and with whom I want to spend the rest of my life. I'm starting to doubt she's out there. His host leaned a little closer. Maybe some of those fears you mentioned earlier are holding you back, Gabe. Maybe you'll discover when you let go of your fear of being vulnerable, you'll find yourself falling in love with the woman you want to marry. A knot coiled in his stomach at her words. He didn't want to admit that any of her words were true. It wasn't fair his host was shining a magnifying glass on all his weaknesses. But he remembered this was exactly what made people choose Winnie O's daytime TV show over many others. She was very good at getting down to the heart of things. Yet he still doubted there was a woman out there who wouldn't try to manipulate him. He doubted there was a woman who wouldn't demand more than he had to give. Before Gabe could comment, she continued, "Are you telling me you've never fallen in love?" Heat prickled his skin, sending another wave of irritating discomfort down his body. Maybe it was time he answered Winnie's question a little differently. Maybe just this once he could veer her off track. "Not recently, but years ago there was one girl that I loved and asked to marry me." "Oh, do tell," Winnie grinned. Gabe enjoyed the moment filled with gasps and wide-eyed surprise. This girl was beautiful, with long blonde hair. She lived by the beach and was always out searching in the water for another rock or plant. I taught her how to sail on my sailboat, and she taught me how to find wonderful plants and creatures under the water. We became good friends. "Go on. You said you asked her to marry you." Gabe nodded. "Yes, she was scared of being alone. Her parents had died, and all she had were 3 aunts who were getting on in age. I told her I would marry her, and then she wouldn't need to be alone or scared." Gabe grinned as he heard oohs and ahs coming from the studio audience. "So, did she agree?" "She told me it would be hard to wait, but that she would marry me." Winnie raised an eyebrow, waiting. Gabe reminded himself that honesty needed to prevail. "I should fess up and tell you that this girl was 6 years old at the time." Winnie O sent him a "can't believe you just did that" grimace. He could hear his brother's chuckle from the front row, but no one else seemed to appreciate his sense of humor. For a fleeting moment, Gabe thought of the scared little girl who had captured his heart all those years ago. He wondered how Rory was doing now. It had been years since he'd last seen her. "Well, Gabe, maybe that's where you should start searching for your bride." His host leaned back on her chair and winked, before turning to her audience. Soon they began to chant "yes," and Winnie O looked at him with a big grin. "Go find this girl, Gabe. See if she will agree to marry you now that she's all grown up." The corners of Gabe's lips turned up slowly. "Maybe I will." His host nodded. "Thanks, Gabe, for joining us here on the Winnie O Show." "Thanks for your kind invitation, Winnie. It was my pleasure." His host looked directly into the camera. There you have it, folks. That was Gabe Stevenson, also known as the #1 personal development mentor in the nation. Keep an eye on Gabe in the months to come. He might surprise us yet and suddenly find and marry the woman he loves. Gabe Stevenson managed to keep his 100-watt white smile that attracted thousands intact. His grandmother had coined the phrase to describe his wide grin, and right now he hoped it would deliver. He couldn't wait to be with his family again. He needed time to simply be himself, away from the crowds. That was a great interview last week, Gabe. His brother Jack came to stand beside him at the helm of his yacht. Gabe grinned as he steered his yacht, Lady Eliza, along Puget Sound waterway. "Yeah, but I must admit many of Winnie O's questions were unexpected and somewhat unnerving. Like when she started asking about the requirements of Grand's inheritance, or if you've ever been in love." "Yes, exactly." Gabe shook his head in silence for a moment, remembering how uncomfortable he'd been sharing his personal life with Winnie O's international audience. "That's understandable," Jack commented as he looked across the wide waterway before turning his gaze back at Gabe. Gabe peered over at his brother and grimaced at the calculated look in his eyes. "What are you thinking?" Jack shrugged, standing there for a moment longer before he spoke. "Just wondering if you've decided to agree to Grand's terms so you can get your inheritance." Steering the yacht forward, Gabe sighed as he saw Walker's Island in the distance. A wave of longing rose up on the inside to own the one piece of land that had given him a sense of belonging and been a huge part of his childhood. Was the price of marriage worth it? To my way of thinking, Grand made the price a little too high for his great-grandsons to receive their inheritance. Gabe expelled a breath, frustrated that marriage was being forced on him. "Yeah, I do understand how you feel." Jack's half-smile played around the corners of his mouth. I was annoyed too when I first realized in order to get my hands on that silver mine I would need to marry. Jack, what made you decide it was worth the price? Well, I was desperate to own the mine and to discover the treasures inside it. Grand had convinced me those treasures were there when I was just a boy. Turns out he was right. Gabe nodded, thinking of how, only a few months ago, Jack and his team of miners had discovered a deep vein of silver, and a few days later they found a small vein of gold. Jack continued talking. But the biggest treasure was marrying Bella. Jack smiled the same sappy smile he'd had on his face since he married his wife a year ago. Well, not all of us can be lucky enough to have a marriage that turns out as well as yours. Gabe was happy for his older brother, but at the same time, the fact that he had to marry made him feel trapped. If he were honest, it was fear of getting too close and letting himself be vulnerable to a woman again that had him real worried. Jack continued to talk. Bella and I definitely didn't begin by thinking our marriage would work. If you remember, we agreed to a marriage of convenience right from the start. The only reason we agreed was because we both benefited. Our marriage certainly hasn't been without its difficult moments, but we fell in love, and we are very blessed to have each other. Who's to say you won't find a woman who'll be the right person for you too, Gabe? Jack persisted in his usual way, trying to dig out problems and fix them. I just don't know, Jack. I've become very wary of women based on my experiences in the past, especially those who have tried to get close to me in order to get what they want. Gabe did his best to dispel the terrible memories. I understand. I have vivid reminders of what it's like from my first marriage. Jack hesitated. A crease formed between his brother's brows, and Gabe could only imagine the unpleasant memories that surfaced. Gabe remembered Ellen and the abrupt way she'd rejected Jack after he arrived home with a scar. She hadn't even cared about the fact that her husband had received the scar because he had heroically saved a teenager from being kidnapped by a human trafficking gang. Only a short time later, Jack's wife and unborn son had died suddenly in a car accident. I know you understand, Jack. I'm sorry you had to go through all that. Gabe was amazed that even though his brother went through so many difficulties, he kept his fighting spirit. Jack hesitated for a moment before speaking again. But regardless of my own doubts, I found someone to marry who is amazing and whom I love with all my heart. I think you owe it to yourself to see if there is someone out there for you, Gabe. Gran believed that finding a wife was a good thing. He wanted that for each of his great-grandsons. I've come to believe he was on to something. Jack bumped Gabe's shoulder with a familiar camaraderie he remembered from when they were kids. Gabe released a sigh, realizing it was time for him to make a decision. Maybe you're right, Jack. Like you and Adam, maybe I will find a woman who will agree to a marriage of convenience. I might take a page from your book and see what happens. Now you're talking, brother. Jack clapped him on the back. You never know, Gabe. Maybe love is waiting for you just around the corner. Well, I don't know about that, Jack, but we'll see what happens. Gabe still had serious doubts that there was an unattached female anywhere whom he could trust enough to marry. However, he was willing to agree to a marriage of convenience. That way, if they had no emotional ties after 1 year, they could part ways with no hard feelings. Gabe was suddenly pulled out of his reverie by childish belly laughter behind him. Jack hurried back to the salon where his 9-month-old son, Walker, was playing with his cousin Daniel. Seeing his mom sitting on the floor of the salon and his family gathered nearby stirred a warmth inside him. His brother's wives, Al and Bella, were enjoying a cup of tea, laughing and talking together. His younger brothers, Luke and Zach, were playing chess. Granddad dozed while Grandmother was busy crocheting yet another set of baby socks. He couldn't deny the longing that rose up inside him to have a family someday. Gabe looked at the horizon and saw Walker's Island getting closer. He had convinced his brothers and their wives, his grandparents and his mum, to join him to visit the island today to take a good look at Gran's old hunting lodge. He needed to take a look at this place and see what needed to be fixed up. His plan was to live there again for a little while as he took a break from his fast-paced schedule. Focusing, he steered his large yacht closer to Walker's Island. As the pier drew near, Gabe slowed the engine until he could swing up next to the dock. He was thankful that years ago Grand had built a long, sturdy pier so large boats could set down anchor near the island. After they stopped, he walked with his family down the dock toward the sandy beach. He could see the chimney top of Grand's hunting lodge straight ahead, partially hidden behind rows of tall trees that circled Walker's Island. Without warning, loud barks shattered the silence, followed by splashing sounds. Gabe turned for a quick look at the beach. He saw 2 dogs running along the water's edge, chasing each other. A young woman stood in the water with her hands on her hips. Her long, blonde ponytail flowed in the wind, and her bubbling laughter caught his attention. For a moment, he stood there, mesmerized, staring at the beautiful woman standing in front of him. Rory Shepard. Memories flooded him of the last time he'd seen her. She'd been 16, and he'd been on the island enjoying 2 weeks that summer with Grand. At the time, he'd been so busy with college and starting his business that he hadn't taken the time to really appreciate those around him. Gabe regretted it later, as that had been the last summer he enjoyed time on the island with Grand before he passed away. They had picnicked on the beach with Grand, Rory, and her 3 aunts. Later that day, they'd all went sailing. Gabe taught Rory how to sail, and he'd been able to get closer to her. She was beautiful, even back then. But she was too naive and too trusting of others, including him. He'd been attracted to her that last summer. For that reason, he'd sent her a note that he couldn't make it to their last time sailing together. Gabe had left the island suddenly the next day with Grand. Regret coiled like a snake in his belly at how shabbily he'd treated her. He couldn't admit his attraction to Rory, so he left. Looking back, Gabe saw his sudden departure as the coward's way out that it was. Rory had always been like a little sister. They weren't related, but all those summers on the island, when he'd taught her snorkeling, fishing, and sailing, made him feel like an older brother. The summer Rory had turned 16 had been a turning point. The sudden realization hit him hard, like a wave breaching the protective walls of a fortress. His childhood friend had blossomed into a beautiful woman. He'd felt himself drawn to her in a way he'd never felt before or since. That new attraction had scared him. He'd left Walker's Island for fear that if he stayed, he would give in to his desires. Back then, Gabe thought more about how he could protect himself rather than what others needed. Rory had always been someone who thought of others before herself. Her selfless giving was what had always captivated him, along with her beautiful face and form. That summer, she'd told him that someday she wanted a family of her own to love. He couldn't believe how naive she was about love. Or was it that he was cynical? The corners of his lips turned up as he remembered. Without conscious thought, Gabe began to walk towards her. Rory stood in a small inlet of water surrounded by trees. She pulled green plants from under the water and tossed them into a bucket at her side. Gabe walked until he stood behind her. He had to admit he enjoyed the view. Grinning, he said, "You still love searching for plants and sea creatures, I see." Rory looked up, startled, and fell backwards into the water. Gabe hurried over and reached out a hand to help her up. Guilt flooded his senses for shocking her and causing her to fall in the water. Large violet blue eyes widened even further, and she stared up at him, unmoving. Hesitantly, she reached up to grab his shoulder with one hand, and with her other clutched long green seaweeds. As Gabe pulled her out of the water, he tugged a little too hard, and Rory fell against his chest. "Sorry, Rory." Gabe held her wet, shivering body close to his. He looked down into those beautiful violet blue eyes that he remembered from years ago. "Gabe, you came back!" Rory breathed out his name as she clung to him. Long dark eyelashes encircled violet blue eyes like sparkling diamonds in the morning sun. Holding her close was doing crazy things to his heart. The urge to lower his head and touch his lips to hers was almost overpowering. Gabe expelled a breath as suddenly dogs barked loudly beside them. He released his grip on her. Rory quickly stepped back and out of his arms. The sudden sense of loss was so acute, Gabe clenched his hands into tight fists to stop himself from reaching for her once more. "Latte and mocha, hush!" Rory patted each of her dogs on the head when they obeyed her command. Rory tossed the dipping seaweed into the bucket beside her and wiped her hands on the drying cloth tucked into the waistband of her shorts. Peering over at him, she whispered, "Are you back to stay, Gabe?" Rory's face clouded with a mixture of hurt and fear. Gabe resisted the urge to wrap his arms around her. He hesitated before replying. "Well, for a few weeks, anyway. Gran decided Walker's Island was to be my inheritance, so I thought I'd fix up the hunting lodge." "I'm so sorry to hear about your great-grandfather's passing, Gabe. I adored that man. He will be sorely missed." "Gran always thought well of you and your 3 aunts, too." "I'm glad. We thought the world of your great-grandfather, too." Rory's eyes turned a little misty as they talked about Gran, and she looked away. Warmth flooded him. He couldn't remember the last time a woman of his acquaintance had been moved to tears from the passing of someone she loved. Her simple and honest emotions were refreshing. Rory crossed her arms over her chest, a furrow forming between her brows. "Years ago, you left the island without saying a proper goodbye, Gabe. You still owe me a day's sailing." Heat crawled up his neck to his cheeks as he remembered. "Sorry about not saying goodbye, Rory. You have every right to be angry." Gabe grimaced and looked out at the water for a moment before turning to look back at her. "Can I take you sailing at the usual time on Friday?" Rory ran a hand along her wet arms, taking a long time to answer him. "I suppose. I'm not so sure that just one sailing trip will make up for it, though. But it's a start." Gabe laughed out loud, realizing he probably did owe her more than one day on his sailboat. "We'll plan for a few trips then. How does that sound?" "Much better, Gabe." Rory shivered and rubbed her arms. "You're freezing. Let me help." Gabe quickly pulled off his hoodie and slipped it around her shivering body. "If your aunts are home tomorrow, I was planning to stop by. Grant had something he wanted to give them." Rory smiled. "Oh, I've no doubt my 3 aunts will be happy to see you. Why don't you stop by for lunch?" Lifting the pail of seaweed, she held it in front of her like a protective shield. "I'll do that, Rory." "Good." She pulled her hoodie tighter around herself before turning to look at him. "I must get home. My aunts will be wondering what kept me. I'll see you tomorrow then, Gabe." Rory quickly nodded and hurried away, her dogs following her every step. Gabe watched her slender figure as she hurried along the trail away from him. His childhood friend was a child no longer. The woman she had become was even more beautiful than he remembered. Yet there was something else. Something had changed. It was like a cloud of fear hung over her. Gabe didn't know what had happened during the last 5 years since he'd last seen Rory, but he was determined to find out. Walking back to Gran's hunting lodge, Gabe found himself looking forward to seeing her again. Vivid memories surfaced of the naive little girl from years ago, pestering him with questions or showing him her latest discovery on the beach. Gabe shook his head from side to side. A voice in his head spoke up. "Gabe, she's not that little girl anymore. Now Rory has become a beautiful woman. Admit it. You are still attracted to her." Gabe turned again to watch his childhood friend until she faded behind tall trees in the distance. He was going to be in her company a lot over the next couple weeks. There was no way he could let his attraction to Rory get out of control. This time he would need to be vigilant. This time he would need to do everything in his power to guard his heart. This time he would need to keep his distance from the one woman who captivated him.